This video offers a brief introduction to Geoffrey Chaucer's biography. Let's begin with what we already know. Chaucer was a poet. The Canterbury Tales are the final major work Chaucer wrote. As we've already noted, Chaucer wrote all of his poetry in Middle English, which was a radical move given the poor reputation of English fiction at the time. I'm by and large here referring to popular romances in Middle English. We can see how daring Chaucer was by choosing to write everything in English, by comparing him with John Gower. Gower was a friend of Chaucer's. He was a lawyer, and he also was a poet with significant literary aspirations. Gower wrote 3 major works. Each of them he wrote in a different language. All of those languages parallel the 3 main languages circulating in England at the time. He wrote one work in English, but another work in French, and another work in Latin. In a sense, Gower was kind of hedging his bets. He dared to write one thing in English, but he wasn't going to go so far as to write everything in English. Instead, he wrote his other works in the more esteemed and privileged languages of Latin and French. Chaucer, on the other hand, goes for it, writing everything in English. If we look at the poetry that Chaucer wrote over his career, we see how early on he seems to have tried to authorize his move in writing in English by associating his texts with France and with French. For example, one of his early English poems is a translation of a work that was first written in French, The Romance of the Rose. Only with the Canterbury Tales, really, does Chaucer break away from this practice of translation and write something that is more distinctly English. It appears that Chaucer was inspired to make this move through the example of Boccaccio. Boccaccio was an Italian poet who dared to write his major work, the Decameron, which is a work that has many similarities with the Canterbury Tales. In any event, Boccaccio dared to write it in the vernacular of Italian, as opposed to Latin, which most aspirational Italian poets would write in. All right, let's turn to other aspects of Chaucer's biography. Chaucer was born in 1340, again, this is the 14th century, to John Chaucer, who was a wine merchant. So his dad was a businessman, basically, a tradesman, and his father lived and worked in London. Chaucer grew up in London and spent most of his time in London. Late medieval London was in many respects very much like Iowa City is today. In essence, you couldn't travel very far in any direction without heading into the countryside, without heading into farmland. Chaucer's dad was a businessman. He was a commoner. But Chaucer, in 1368, when he was 28 years old, Chaucer gained a foothold in the aristocracy. That year, he became an esquire. He achieved that status through jobs that he had, and Chaucer had a lot of jobs. Some of those jobs took him into the court. As a boy, he was a page in the household of a countess, and later he became a courtier. He was a member, that is, of the court of the king at the time, Richard II. Chaucer also was a soldier. He fought in the 100 Years' War. This is a war between England and France that spanned the 14th and 15th centuries. Chaucer was also a diplomat. He negotiated on behalf of the crown during the 100 Years' War with France. His diplomatic identity also involved negotiations with Italians in Italy. Chaucer was also a bureaucrat. He was a big-time bureaucrat. He had many jobs as a civil servant. Chaucer also had a series of legal and political jobs. He was a justice of the peace, which literally meant that he was in charge of keeping the peace, and he was a member of Parliament. Chaucer held these last two jobs not in London, but in Kent, located in southeast England. Chaucer's move from London to Kent seems to have been very canny, very smart. Chaucer left London during a time of tremendous upheaval at court, a time when many figures who were linked with the king, Richard II, were being prosecuted for treason and executed. Some of those men who lost their heads were Chaucer's friends. Chaucer seems to have been sensitive to that political danger. The Canterbury Tales reflect Chaucer's canny relation to politics. England in the 14th century was a time of major upheaval and change. It was a time when received ideas of social and religious order were being challenged in many sorts of ways. For example, a group of people known as the Lollards or Wycliffites called out corruption in the Christian church. The Lollards were, in a sense, early versions of the people behind the religious reformations that occurred in England and elsewhere during the Reformation. The Lollards were a proto-Reformation group. Another example of the political, social, and religious upheavals happening during Chaucer's life is the 1381 rebellion, an event I'll talk more about in future lectures. The rebellion involved commoners getting together from throughout England and revolting against their servitude. One of the noteworthy aspects of Chaucer's poetry is the careful way in which he addresses the upheavals of the 14th century. In the same way that he knew to get out of court and move to Kent when things got dangerous, he engages in strategies in the Canterbury Tales that allow him both to weigh in on the changes happening in England and protect himself from getting into trouble. So as you read the Canterbury Tales, as you read the general prologue, the Miller's prologue, the Miller's Tale, think about how Chaucer is at once being daring, speaking to what's going on, but also kind of covering himself, protecting himself. So as you read the Canterbury Tales, be on the lookout for this strategy.